Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today, we'll be exploring the quantum mind. With me is Brenda Dunne, who is co-author with Robert John of a book called Quirks of the Quantum Mind. Brenda served as laboratory manager for the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab for 28 years. Currently, she is the director of the International Consciousness Research Lab in Princeton, New Jersey. She is also co-author with Robert John of Margins of Reality, the Role of Consciousness in the Physical World, as well as Consciousness and the Source of Reality, the Pair Odyssey, and Being and Biology, Is Consciousness the Life Force, which is an anthology that she edited with Robert John, along with another book that she co-authored with Robert John called Molecular Memories. Welcome, Brenda.
Thank you, Jeff. It's wonderful to be here with you.
It's a pleasure to be with you, and I'm delighted that you took the time and trouble to come to Albuquerque to be with me.
It's a wonder. If I had known what a lovely place, I'd come more often.
And you're welcome to. I'd love to have you back. Now, you spent 28 years basically looking at the interaction of human beings with quantum mechanical systems primarily. I know you had other forms of random event generators that were not quantum mechanical, and you also did remote viewing research, but a big part of the work that you did involved something that would have been considered impossible, that human intention can affect quantum mechanical interactions.
Well, that's true.
Yeah.
It was a fascinating journey. We learned a lot. But I think one of the most intriguing parts was once we got past the technical aspects of the experiments, the data collection, the data processing, the analytical whatevers. You ended up with some very interesting and very intriguing anomalies. Things that could not be explained by any known model in either physics or in psychology.
Brain twisters, so
Brain twister, indeed.
Yeah.
You know, phenomena that seem to be independent of distance or time. Things that seem to have no known means of energy transfer or communication that we know of. But yet here was statistically significant evidence that something was happening. Statistics, unfortunately, can go so far as to tell you whether or not something happened, but it doesn't do much in the way of telling you what it is that happened. And so, beyond the experimental components of our program, Bob, John, and I spent a lot of time, just mulling over what is going on? How can you explain this? What's happening here?
Now, the interesting thing is that your writing partner and your research partner, Bob John, really was a physicist.
Oh, yes. He was a first-class rocket scientist and had spent 15 years as dean of Princeton's School of Engineering. No, he was hardcore. If there was something that could be explained by traditional recognized science, he would know it. But even he had to throw up his hands and say, there is something else going on here. What we found, though, in our various conversations was that there were ways of communicating that perhaps could not be captured in our scientific language. And I think part of that was because Bob and I were very different. We came from very different backgrounds. We had very different areas of expertise and interest. I was, as I just said, he was an engineer, a physicist, mathematics, traditional reductionistic, the whole ball of wax.
Well, what I think is fascinating, if I may interrupt, is that you describe your relationship almost in physical terms, like wave-particle complementarity. He's the particle and you're the wave.
You got it. And that's really just what I was about to say. You anticipated me. But we found that from a metaphorical standpoint, even given our differences in our personalities and our styles, it was fun to find these similes. Mm-hmm. As I became aware of the wave-particle duality that everybody, when is light, a wave or a particle kind of thing that really troubled the early physicists early in the last century a great deal. Bob and I could joke about it. Bob would say things to me as I would ramble on, as I have a tendency to do it. Will you get to the point? And I'd say, point? There is no point.
What's a point?
What's a point? Bob never got lost. He had a great sense of direction. He also was he had clocks. He must have had about 12 clocks in his house, maybe 20. Every room had a clock. I don't do clocks. I don't do watches. I don't do time. Okay? But then I thought to myself, I don't need to apologize for not doing time or space. I can do frequencies and amplitudes. So, Bob, you do the time and space. And, what was great, Jeff, was if we drove somewhere together. If I was behind the wheel, we were doing fine. Bob was reading the maps. Uh-huh. This was before GPS. And he would navigate. We would get where we were going. Okay? Mm. Now, if we switched roles, and he was behind the wheel, and I was reading the map, A, we would get lost, and B, we would run into traffic. It just didn't work the other way around. Mm-hmm. But again, you start talking about such a thing jokingly. All right, you're the particle, I'm the wave. And then you find that becomes a metaphor for so many other things in other dimensions. You got particles and waves. You've got yin and you've got yang, and you've got masculine and you've got feminine, and you've got analytical and you've got impressionistic, and you've got scientific and you've got aesthetic. And you find that these domains, which we have always tended to think of as dualities, either or, were actually not dualistic. They were complementary in the sense that Niels Bohr had proposed as a way of accommodating this wave-particle duality in quantum mechanics. Mm-hmm. It isn't a wave or a particle. It is both.
Which totally seems to confound Aristotelian logic.
It does, but it's just two ways of looking at the same thing. I have occasionally described this perspective as my grapefruit universe. Okay? You're a scientist, you buy some grapefruit. You slice it, you open it up, and here are these nice star-shaped segments. Take another grapefruit, cut it open. Well, you do this maybe a couple of 100 times, and one day you cut it, and you go, oh my God, this is a different kind of grapefruit. It doesn't have the usual star shape. It has these other, obviously those are more common than these, so this must be a recessive gene, of the grapefruit family. And now I can write a paper describing how I have just discovered a subspecies of grapefruit. Well, it isn't a different kind of grapefruit. It's just a matter of how you slice it. Mm. And our experience of the world is a matter of how you slice it. We may see it as intellectual versus artistic, or yin versus yang, but it isn't either or. It's all both and it all depends on how you are perceiving it. Now, please step back a little bit. As we explored some of these concepts and the quantum mechanical principles, I had no no understanding of quantum mechanics when I met Bob, and he tried to explain it to me, and he was a fantastic teacher. He could take the most complex subject and explain it in beautiful, clear terms, and you go, oh, is that all it is? As, one of our earliest conversations in which he had asked me to describe what I thought was going on in these anomalous phenomena. And when I told him, he said, oh, that's very interesting. It reminds me of the covalent bond. And I said, what's a covalent bond? Well, as he describes it to me, I go, oh, that's really interesting. You guys are walking around with the answer, but you don't even know what the question is. I know what the question is. And we went on from that point further into him explaining some of this quantum mechanical concepts to me. And he asked me to sit in on a class he was giving. This was a graduate level course on quantum mechanics. And I said, I'm not going to understand what you're talking about. You're going to have all these, fancy equations up on the blackboard and all the math. I'm going to just feel stupid. And he said, no. I just want you to listen behind the math and the equations to the concepts. You'll understand it. And indeed, he did explain it very well. And after several of the class meetings, one of the other students said, say, aren't you a psychologist? And I said, yes. He says, why are you taking a class in quantum mechanics? And I said, quantum mechanics? Gee, I thought this was the psychology of subatomic particles. And of course, the kid in the class didn't find that particularly humorous. But it was, because what we discovered as we explored this further was that all of the concepts that underlie the theory of quantum mechanics were derived from subjective experience. We talk about mass. Hey, that's heavy.
Yeah.
We talk about distance, far out. That's very close to my heart. We talk about energy. We talk, I'm so excited, or that really turns me on. Or you can find analogies to every one of these physical concepts in the subjective domain of personal experience. And we just explored this. We had a wonderful time taking quantum mechanics apart and looking for these wave particle complementarities, and all the rest of them. Perhaps one of them, or two of the most fascinating and I think most profound aspects of quantum mechanics was Niels Bohr's proposition of complementarity itself. The fact that you no longer had to speak of things in terms of either or, but you could speak in terms of how you slice it. It depends on how you observe the system. And of course, along with that was the accompanying concept of that came from Heisenberg of uncertainty.
So when we talk about complementarity and Niels Bohr's idea, it still sort of boggles the conventional mind, the Aristotelian mind. Something cannot be both a particle and a wave. It seems impossible, and yet the only way it would seem to resolve itself is to say that the observer causes the phenomenon to change.
And that is what the quantum physicists maintain.
Yeah.
That an event is only probabilistic until it is observed. And that's fine as far as it goes. But when you observe an event, it's still out there. There's you and there's the event you're observing.
Well, it seems that way, again, to the conventional mind, but ultimately everything you observe is within your sensorium, within your consciousness. You don't observe out there. You only infer that there is an out there because you're having an experience.
And what you are describing is not what's out there. You're describing your experience.
Yeah.
You're describing your experience of that.
In fact, you can never get outside of your own experience.
Well, but sometimes you can get your experience inside of the rest of the world. But that's a whole different matter, and we don't deal with that in physics, of course. Although I must say that the folks who created the whole model of quantum theory believed quite strongly, virtually all of them, in some of these mystical dimensions and different traditions from different countries and cultures. They were very open to that. They spent a lot of time talking about the role of consciousness and the role of observation. But observation is only one form of interaction. There is the sort of, what was it that Buber spoke about? The I, it versus the I, thou.
Martin Buber, yes, the great philosopher of Hasidic Judaism.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But he was so right on. There is something out there, and I can objectify it. I can distance myself from it and say, I'm here and it's there. Mm-hmm. And then it's an it.
Yeah.
Or I can relate to it. I can identify with it in some way and say, oh, I'm a part of this. It's a part of me. We're connected. And now it's a thou.
Mm-hmm.
It's no longer an it. And the experience becomes very different. And the description of the experience draws on different kinds of metaphors. Now, and of course, when you're talking about that kind of experiential connection, you can only speak about it in metaphors. If you want to go further, you can say that everything we talk about is a metaphor, because all we can do is draw metaphors that attempt to describe our experience of something out there. Mm-hmm. And so any model, whether it's quantum mechanics or classical physics or macroeconomics or, marketing, or it's all metaphors. Yeah. It is all the attempt to communicate something that we have experienced subjectively in an objective way that will make sense to another person who presumably shares your language.
Well, you mentioned earlier that Bob John had a house full of clocks.
Yes.
And a clock is actually a very common metaphor. It's a mechanism. Mm-hmm. And we create mechanisms. Every mechanism has a creator. But we assume that the universe itself is a mechanism.
Yeah. And we presume that time and distance space are qualities of the universe. No. Time and space are properties of consciousness that we employ to, I think it was Einstein who said, to keep everything from happening all at once. We have to categorize. Otherwise, it's just everything.
Yeah.
We're out there in this world of potentiality, but there's no distinctions anywhere.
And there are moments when people enter into what is sometimes called cosmic consciousness, where they report that they are experiencing everything all at once.
Yes. Just so.
Have you had that happen in the lab?
Well, I have had it happen personally.
Uh-huh.
It has happened in the lab and indirectly. It was something that if it happened, we didn't really talk about it in the lab. We talked about it personally. Yeah. I think everybody on our staff really had an interest in that dimension. And I think we all recognized that we were dealing with something far more than engineering anomalies. And it was pretty early on that we recognized that although we were ostensibly studying the potential vulnerability of engineering systems to their human operators' state of mind, that we were tapping into something much deeper. We were looking at how these anomalies were showing us that there was more to what was going on in the world, more to consciousness than we understood. Somehow or other, consciousness, whatever it was playing a role here, and it was more than just intention. It was also the feeling of resonance. In science, you can't talk about things like love, but you can talk about resonance, being on the same wavelength, to coin a metaphor.
Mm-hmm.
And it was clear that this was an important part of what we were observing and measuring using our scientific tools.
Now, resonance is interesting. When I think of resonance, I think of tuning forks.
Mm-hmm.
If I have two tuning forks that are tuned to the same pitch and I strike one of them and hold it near the other one will start to resonate.
Yes. And so you find that two entities that are resonating are on the same wavelength. The metaphors are wonderful. Let's acknowledge metaphor as a critical part of communication because it's the only one we have. And this is like that. Yeah. This reminds me of that. It is like but this is how we communicate any concept in any area.
Well, you've got a laboratory in the basement of the engineering department or School of Engineering at Princeton University. You're not supposed to be dealing with any of the human aspects, but you're asking people to come in to your lab and resonate with quantum mechanical random event generators.
Yes. And we are instructed by the university's Human Subjects Committee to be certain that the people who participated in our studies did not suffer from delusions of metaphysical capabilities, which I thought was hilarious.
Yeah.
It actually, they did us a favor. People would come in and, they might be a little nervous, even though the place didn't look anything like a university laboratory. But there was still, I'm here, who are these people? What are they doing? And I would explain to them that the university insists that whatever happens in these experiments, you should not leave here thinking you're God. Unless, of course, you thought you were God when you came in which case we don't want to disabuse you of that. And they would laugh. They would laugh.
It is funny.
Yes, but they laughed, you see. They relaxed.
Yeah.
It was okay. We shared a joke. We were resonating. I believe that element was an important part of not that particular story, but that connection with the experimenters and the participants on a one-to-one human level was an important part of what made the phenomena manifest.
Brenda, I have to tell you a story. Because the York University in Toronto, a physicist there named Stan Jeffers attempted a replication of your research, and it was unsuccessful. Now, I happen to personally be a friend of a lady from Toronto, Diane Hughes, who was a research participant in that laboratory, and she described to me how she was treated when she walked into the lab.
That's wonderful.
And I don't think this has ever come out yet. I don't think this is public knowledge, but she was aghast because the explanation that she was given was more like, this isn't going to work.
Actually, it has come out because I believe we talked about that episode in Consciousness and the Source of Reality. It was a wonderful experience. Stanley could not get any results. So he said, look, would you like the apparatus? Because I'm going to just get rid of it. Wasted my time. So we said, sure, bring it down. And he brought it down to the Pear Lab. And I said to him, how did you introduce your participants to this experiment? And he launched into this long, tedious, dull description of optics. And after he got through this and my eyeballs are rolling in my head, he goes to the line, he says, of course there are some people who actually think you can affect a process like this. And I thought to myself, of course you didn't get results, you jerk. How could you possibly get results after you've just insulted your participants by saying, if you think this works, you're obviously one of those. Well, I thanked him. I said, I think I understand. This is what your friend told you. We took that device, we said, and by the way, the device he designed by our standards was very vulnerable. It was, we made it airtight. We had our group go to work on it. By the time we finished, there was no question, but this was top-notch engineering. And then we told some of our participants, hey, we've got a new experiment here. It has something to do with light. I don't really understand it, but I can find out and get someone to explain it. But basically, it has something to do with light particles going through one hole or another. But really what you want to do is you want to try to get this bar to go up or down. And they would say, hey, that sounds like fun. Sure, I'd like to try it. And so we ran that experiment in our lab, and we got very significant results using Stanley's apparatus, but certainly not his approach.
Yeah.
Critically important. People in parapsychology and other fields talk about experimenter effects. Why is it that some people get results and other people don't? Maybe it's really the experimenter that's getting no, it is the experimenter who is, if they're good, is creating an atmosphere of sharing, of collaboration between the participants and the experimenters and the machines and the staff, where we're all doing this together. And it becomes fun. And people approach it, we encourage them to approach it like a game. Don't worry about the results. No matter what happens, we're going to learn something. Mm-hmm. So just have a good time. And that was how we encouraged them to approach the tasks. We didn't tell them, now you do this or you do that, or let's see how psychic you are. None of the people in our group, in our program, regarded themselves as particularly psychic. They were curious. They were interested. They thought, this sounds like it might be fun. And we wanted them to come back, you see, because given the nature of our explorations, and the fact that we weren't studying the people, but the people interacting with the machines, and there was no reason to suspect or expect that person A interacting with machine B was going to be the same as person C interacting with machine B. We couldn't even assume that person A interacting with machine B was going to get the same effect if they did it twice.
Right.
And of course we didn't.
Mm-hmm.
And so that became a really important part of our laboratory ambiance. So the place was a little magic kingdom next to the machine shop. You know, you'd walk down this white car painted, and you'd open the door, and there you'd find these, carpeting and wood paneling and this big orange couch full of stuffed animals, pictures on cartoons all over the walls, coffee and tea and juice and cookies and, and friendly people who were happy to see you and welcomed you like family. That's the experimenter effect.
Now, let me ask you this question, hypothetically. So let's suppose for a moment that you were the dean of the School of Engineering and the director of the laboratory, and you hired Bob John, a young budding engineer, to be your laboratory manager. Would you have gotten the same result?
Probably not.
Yeah.
Probably not. Although Bob understood this, I think his style was quite different because, he was a trained academic and administrator, and which was very effective in his being a dean.
Yeah.
But he was not as, I'm trying to think, I can't say he wasn't friendly, he was very friendly, but he was not as accessible or approachable.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was just his style. I think Bob was wonderful at what he contributed to the lab, namely the concepts, the expertise, the designs, the analytical approaches, the technical reportage.
All of which is necessary.
All of which is necessary, and none of which I could have done well. But I was good with people. I could make people laugh. I could put them at ease, and I think Bob knew that.
It was his genius, I suppose, to have selected you. And to be fair, not only did you have a professional relationship, you had a personal relationship for decades.
Oh, yes. No, we were dear friends. We were, spiritual partners, in a very profound way. But he also was smart enough, and as was I, to hire a staff of people who could do the things that needed to be done in the other dimension.
Mm-hmm.
So I could, for example, be very good at inviting a bunch of 10-year-old or 11-year-old kids into the lab and explaining the basics of statistics and distribution functions and standard deviations and whatnot in a way that an 11-year-old could understand it. which Bob could do that with a grad student, but I don't know how good he'd be with an 11-year-old. And certainly the other members of our staff, they all brought some skill that was precious. Okay? I mean, there was one member of the lab that just couldn't stand it when these kids would come by. It would drive him nuts. He'd always find some reason to be somewhere else that day. But that was okay. He recognized that he didn't want to be there.
It strikes me as we're speaking about it that it's the child inside of us that doesn't know that you can't do these things.
Yes.
That is the one that needs to come out to make it happen.
This is where we really need, if we really want to change the paradigm, if we want people to be able to be comfortable and accept this dimension of ourselves, we need to start when they're little. By the time they get to college, they've been brainwashed. Especially if they've gotten into college, they've been brainwashed. I mean, they've been told how to think. What is. This is the way it is. These are the answers in the back of the book.
Right.
No. Hey, little kids, I have a secret for you. There are no answers in the back of the book. Science has nothing to do with answers. It has to do with questions. It has to do, if you answer the right question, you will get the right answer. That's not how they're taught. You need to feel confident in yourself. You need to be willing to go beyond what you think you already know and question things that you already believe. Why do you believe this? What makes you think that this is the way it is? When you look at the grass and you see a color that's green, are you seeing the same thing I'm seeing when I look at that grass? We may both call it green, but is the experience? These are the questions. Ask yourself this. Don't be afraid of it. You can't tell that to a college student. Though I came close one day. We had a group of, there were a bunch of undergraduate jocks, one of these big football playing guys that had to come through to do a lab visit to our program. Okay. And they came in, they sat down on the couch. There probably were 8 or so of them. And they were all looking at each other like, do we really have to, oh, Jesus, well, all right, tough guys. And I came in, I said, I saw what was going on. I said, this is going to be a tough one. So I sat down on a chair in front of them. I said, I said, hello, I'm Brenda Dunne, and I want to welcome you to the Pear Lab. I said, the Pear Lab has been here for quite a long time. And in fact, the Pear Lab has been here probably longer than you guys have been here. In fact, we've been here so long that if I tell you the story of the Pear Lab, I should start with once upon a time. There was an undergraduate who wanted to do a research project to see whether people could affect the way a random process could, and I went on with this, and I had the 3 evil professors. Oh no, said this professor, you can't do that. Oh no, said the other. Well, the student went in to see the good dean and said, oh, will you supervise my program? And the dean agreed to do it. And we're going on with this. And I had this sort of sing-song, and they were all listening. And one by one, each of these big, tough guys has reached behind him and grabbed a stuffed animal and is sitting there holding this teddy bear. And by the time I got to how we all lived happily ever after, that whole team was sitting there holding an animal. I mean, I caught them at the 5-year-old level. I mean, it was a brilliant move. I don't know if I could ever pull that off again. But it was wonderful to see the expressions on the faces of these tough undergraduate jock kids. I mean, these were tough guys. And yet you could see something behind that toughness that was still in there. Once upon a time, there was a little girl, and there were these 3 evil I mean, it was all there, and it worked. It worked. So what was happening there, Jeff? What were we talking to? How did we manage to create an environment? And incidentally, one of those kids actually ended up doing a very interesting independent project with our lab after that.
I was wondering, once they got to the teddy bear stage, if they might now want to try to influence one of your machines.
They had a chance to try it. We showed them the machines. We gave them a chance to see if they could do it. And, I mean, we ended up having a really nice interaction. It was not what they expected. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure it was what I expected.
But you're open to the spontaneity of the moment.
Yeah. And I'm open to trying. This is what you asked, if Bob could have done that. I think not. Mm-hmm. I can't imagine Bob sitting there in front of a bunch of college football players saying once upon a time. It just would not be his style.
Right.
But he had no objection to me doing it. Mm-hmm. And he took some delight in it. Mm-hmm. And he was the first one to say the complementarity between what Brenda brings and what I bring is what makes this program work. This is where it comes together. And that was what was going on.
Well, this is what I think is a very important lesson for any of our viewers who are contemplating a career doing this kind of work. What you have just said may be a crucial key.
I think it is. Mm-hmm. When people have asked me, what do I need to do, to get involved in this field, I sort of shake my head and I say, well, there's 3 things you're going to need. You're going to need a very well-calibrated random event generator. You're going to need a very thick skin. And you're going to need a good sense of humor. Mm-hmm. Because you're not going to be able to do it otherwise. You're going to be running into opposition. You're going to be running into people who disagree with your point of view, who disregard your data. And you're not going to convince them. There's no amount of evidence or statistics that's going to convince somebody who believes that what you're talking about is inconsistent with their belief system. It's too threatening. But we were talking earlier, we started out talking about the quantum mind.
Yes.
And I think that's a really valuable approach. When we first came up with this idea and we wrote it up and we thought we had something rather clever, except the title, which was wrong. We called it On the Quantum Mechanics of Consciousness with application to anomalous phenomena. Yeah. We submitted the paper to Foundations of Physics. The editor was willing to consider it. He sent it out for review. That paper went out for review to something on the order of 20 reviewers, which is very statistically unlikely. And, we had half of them would say this is nonsense. The other half would say, no, this is profound. And the others would say, no, it's just a metaphor. The other one would say, oh, but it provides an important insight. Well, finally, Bob called up the editor and he said, look, this is getting kind of silly. Why don't we just take a majority vote? Mm-hmm. And it turned out that there was, I think, one more vote in favor and they ended up publishing the article. When we wanted to publish a subsequent paper some years later, they didn't want it. Same thing had happened with the proceedings of the IEEE. Our readers have no interest in this topic. We had some other editor who said, when Professor John can transmit his manuscript to my editors telepathically, we might consider publishing it. These were prominent science journals.
They undoubtedly got flack from somebody for having published it in the first place.
Oh, yes. No, this was...
there are people who simply believe these things cannot and should not happen.
And it has
I've run into it plenty. Every parapsychologist has.
It has no place in the scientific dimension. Yeah. This is pseudoscience. It's not real science. Yeah. Well, what we did was we got together, Bob had some contacts with people out on the West Coast. Peter Sturrock, who was an astrophysicist at Stanford. Yes. There are a couple of other astrophysicists down at the University of Virginia. Ian Stevenson, who was doing reincarnation work at University of Virginia. And there were a handful of people who were interested in some of these less popular areas that they were all well-credentialed scientists and academics. They all had an established field of expertise, but they all had an interest in some area that was outside the box. And they were getting frustrated because they couldn't publish, they couldn't present at professional meetings. They couldn't talk to their colleagues about it. And so way back in it was maybe around 1980, 81, or somewhere like that, they decided to create their own professional society called the Society for Scientific Exploration.
Yeah, and of which you have been an officer.
I have been an officer. Bob has been for many years, I was the education officer. And my goal there was to try to attract more young people, which was not easy. Because those young people are college students and they're going to get into deep trouble if they show an interest. But that's beside the point.
But I think it's worth mentioning parenthetically, at least, that you're here in Albuquerque today because you're on your way to Denver where they're having their annual conference.
Right. And this is the 30-some-odd, annual meeting. And it's a great group of people. But it's more than that. First of all, it's a forum where people can come and give their presentations about their work in these very strange fields. You might want to be talking about UFOs or cryptobiology, Bigfoots or the Loch Ness Monster. Or you might want to talk about alternative healing or magic, this or parapsychology. You name it.
Yeah, all fields that prior to this organization generally didn't want to communicate with each other because they were all striving for some kind of respectability, and they all felt that all of these other neighboring disciplines were less respectable.
Right, but at SSE we were just all huddling together for warmth.
Yeah,
it was like we've all run into the same sort of opposition.
Yeah.
We started a journal, the Journal of Scientific Exploration, which has now in its umpty-umph volume.
Yes. And I might point out that most of the historical articles are available and accessible on the World Wide Web.
Right. They're all online.
The Journal of Scientific Exploration.
Yes. And the website of the organization is scientificexploration.org. So we had now a vehicle for publishing, and the journal was a peer-reviewed journal. It still is.
Edited by my friend Stephen Browdy, the former chairman of the philosophy department at the University of Maryland.
Yeah. Steve is the editor of the journal.
Yeah.
It is a good journal. There are wonderful book reviews in there.
Yeah.
There are articles and essays where people have the opportunity to express unpopular, unacknowledged ideas, but they have to be scholarly. They have to be done, we don't want to be attracting all kinds of crackpot. I mean, if you've done research, we want to know how you've done it. If you have a thesis you want to present, you've got to present it in a logical and reasonable way. And people are available to write back and say, I disagree with you on this, or you should have done such and such. But it's polite. I can't recall ever there being any kind of animosity within the organization, even though there are frequent disagreements.
Yeah.
I can remember somebody in the UFO field commenting to a mutual friend, well, after hearing, I think it may have been one of our papers, and said, this stuff is really tough. The UFO stuff is easy to accept, but this is really far out. Okay, well, I felt the same way about the UFO stuff. Okay, but I listened and I learned, and I found different ways of thinking, and I found ways to go across the disciplines and say maybe there's a commonality here between the UFO phenomenon and the psychic phenomenon and the reincarnation. What's common to all of these? What is happening? Somewhere there's consciousness involved.
Yeah.
Somewhere or other, there is something about consciousness having an experience and describing that experience in a way, in a language that they're comfortable with, but may not be understandable by somebody else. I can recall my first week in graduate school. I think the first lesson I learned, maybe it was the most important lesson I learned in graduate school, was these folks are talking in their own jargon. We're not talking about developmental psychology. We're talking about learning how to use the right words so we can identify ourselves as part of this particular community. It doesn't matter what we're saying.
The insight, isn't it?
Yeah. That's what the game is. And then, of course, by the time I got to Princeton, I understood the game. It's all a question of how you say it. We never talked about parapsychology. We talked about engineering anomalies. Parapsychology was scaring them. Of course, engineering anomalies scared them also, but not quite as badly, and it took them a little while.
Sooner or later, they're going to figure out what you're up to, and ultimately it evokes a deep subconscious fear that the rational mind tries to suppress by suggesting, basically, witchcraft doesn't exist.
Oh, yeah.
Witchcraft doesn't exist.
Well, I think I told you the story about how we had early on put this Greek letter Psi on the door.
Yeah.
To identify. I thought that was very clever at the time. We're talking psychic phenomena, psyche, wave function, Anyway, there it was. And a couple of people would come by and look at us, stare at the door with this terror on their face. Why do you have a devil's pitchfork on your door? Well, no, it's not a devil's pitchfork. It's a Greek letter.
Uh-huh.
But there was something I'm thinking, this is interesting. This is, okay, I'm a psychologist, right? I'm into the history of religion. I'm into, I may not know the Schrödinger equation, but I know fear when I see it. And so we took down the sign. We put up this, spiral galaxy, you are here. Another one came along and said, that's not our galaxy. I said, really? Well, I'm glad you told me. I'd hate to have a misleading. What the hell is going on here? Mm-hmm. What is... These are intellectual. These are Princeton students.
Let me tell you a story. Martin Gardner, who was when he lived, was one of the most prominent of the psychop skeptics. He had a regular column in Scientific American, and he loved to evoke the horse laugh when it came to parapsychology. But he wrote an autobiographical novel. And in it, he described his own childhood growing up in a fundamentalist family. Oh, yes. He grew up in a very rigid fundamentalist family where he learned to hate the devil. That was part of it. I mean, you hate the devil. You love Jesus and you hate the devil. But he broke away from that. He became a modern rationalist. But what he did, and I think what many of these people do at a subconscious level, certainly not consciously, they substitute the fear of the devil, the fear of witchcraft, the fear of evil for what they now call the rising tide of superstition.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you something. We finally took down the "You Are Here" sign. We put a pear on the door. Nobody seemed to take offense at that for many years. In the last maybe 2 years, the devil made me do it. I took down the pear and I put up a picture of a gingerbread house.
Oh.
Nobody noticed it. By that time, they were so used to us being there, they never looked at our door.
Uh-huh.
But they used to, talk about us seducing all these little kids to come in.
Yes, you were evoking an image associated with witchcraft.
Come in and have a cookie. We'll fatten you up on unacceptable ideas. We will teach you how to think for yourself.
Uh-huh.
Apparently it didn't have much of an effect. Nobody noticed it except me. But I got a chuckle out of doing it. But it was the phenomena, the psychological reactions to this topic in many ways are far more interesting than the phenomena themselves.
Yeah.
People's reactions. And this is why I return to this point I made earlier, that we've really got to open up the mind when we're young. One of the things we've been thinking about doing at ICRL is creating some educational toys. For example, we, based on the research that this French scientist did with these little chicks.
Yes, we talked about it in a previous study.
We, of course, couldn't bring chickens in. We had enough trouble with the human subjects committee. We didn't need the animal subject. But what we did was we built a little robot that was driven by a random process, had a little light on top of it, and there was a a little detector in the ceiling that would track this light and record the trajectory of the robot in a computer file. It looked like a little Zamboni machine, and just to make it more fun, we had a little frog in our lab, a little stuffed frog that sat on it, and it had a license plate that said Froggy 1. And the kids who came to visit loved this. But the idea was this was on a circular table, and you would attempt to get the robot with its little frog driver to come to one side of the table or another. And here you had this thing automatically recording. You could look at the data and see how long it spent on one side or the other. But the thing was, the kids that came loved it. Oh, where can I get one of these? Well, you can't. We don't, they're not. Well, why aren't they available?
They're not for sale.
Why aren't they? Why can't we create a product like this that we could sell as toys? But they would be educational toys where kids could learn to communicate telepathically with their little froggy.
Well, I imagine in the future these sorts of things will be embedded into the video games that kids are already playing all the time.
They already be, for all we know. There's a lot of other stuff embedded in them. Why not?
Well, you could say that, Las Vegas slot machines are simply a big parapsychology laboratory.
No, I think there are ways that we could. One of the goals of ICRL, International Consciousness Research Labs, has been an educational component. Finding ways to broaden the scope of early education so that kids could learn at a very early age how to create these kinds of experiments, like the students who came to our lab years ago. How to build a random event generator and how to do it like the undergraduate did. And we've got a colleague up in Canada who is a teacher, and she's been working with this with her class. And it goes beyond that. She's talking about, self-confidence and value and sharing and working together. I mean, it's an amazing program. And when I met her class last year, I was really thrilled. I said, this is where it has to happen. These kids understand it. There was this one boy, rather reserved, quiet kid. A lot of her kids were special needs students. And this one kid who was technically, very expert, but socially kind of withdrawn, turned to me and he said, Mrs. Dunne, what do you think consciousness really is? And I said, well, it's just my own opinion. I can't vouch for anybody else, but for me, it's the organizing principle of the universe. And he took this in, nodded his head, and he said, that's heavy. And I said, yeah, it is. This is a 10-year-old. 10 years old. This is a little kid. That's heavy, he said. He got it. He got it.
Well, viewers of this channel may know we did an interview not long ago on the existence of God, in which my guest, a literary scholar, James Driscoll, used that as the definition of God, the organizing principle of the universe. What a coincidence.
I prefer to spell consciousness with a capital C. In the beginning, consciousness said, let there be light, let there divide, let us create distinctions, let us separate this from that, let us, it's the creative force of the universe. It is that which organizes meaning out of potentiality, the random flux of possibility that we call the source. But there's an organizing principle that goes in there, and it works with intention and with resonance. The intention sets a goal. Okay? I want to know where Jeffrey is going to be next Tuesday at 4:00. I have now excluded any kind of possibilities that have no relevance to Jeffrey next Tuesday at 4:00. But that's necessary but not sufficient, as the people say. Now, I have to try to create a connection with where Jeffrey is next Tuesday at 4. Hi, Jeffrey. Brenda here. Where are you? What's around you? What are you seeing? What are you experiencing? And I want to resonate with I know you. I feel you. What are you doing? What are you experiencing? And that's how remote viewing works. Mm-hmm. There's both. There's creating the distinction, but then there is the resonating and hauling out from that possibility, that realm of possibility, the information that you're looking for. The more you think about it, it's not really that complicated. It's certainly not as complicated as some of the folks who are trying to explain consciousness as an epiphenomenon of the physical brain. Yeah. That I find complicated. But, Bob used to say, a remark about how we saw this back in the days of Galileo. The extremes to which the physicists or scientists, whatever, natural philosophers, whatever they call themselves then, would go to create a model that kept the Earth at the center. And they had all these cycles and this incredible complexity, when all they had to do was just move the sun to the middle. But it was so threatening. It was threatening to the established church. It was, it broke all the rules. It went against your intuitive sense that we are the center. I mean, that was monumental.
And it took hundreds of years for the church to admit that they made a mistake for jailing Galileo for his belief.
And I think we're seeing something like that. I think we're seeing the scientific community tearing its hair out, desperately trying to find some way to accommodate these anomalies within their reductionistic, deterministic, physicalistic model that says we can explain it all by physics. Yeah. No, we can explain physics by consciousness. We cannot explain consciousness by physics.
Bottom line.
Mm-hmm. Physics is simply the expression of consciousness. Let's just invert it, and then it all becomes rather simple, and it makes a lot of sense. But first you have to accept the possibility that the way you see the world may not be the only way there is.
Well, stand on your head for a while. That might help. Brenda Dunne, what a joyful conversation. It's always a pleasure for me to be with you. You are a mistress and a master of what you do and what you have accomplished over the decades. Your life experiences are so valuable. It really warms my heart to know that I can share this with our viewing audience.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey. I am delighted to have this opportunity that you provide to share it with other people. I love what I've done. I am excited about it, as you probably can tell. Yeah. And I feel very privileged to have had the opportunity to do this work and to sense that maybe there's a handful of people out there who will hear it and understand it, or maybe read one of our books and say, that's not that far off. It does sort of make sense. Mm-hmm. I've been having a very similar reaction to the work of Benedict Spinoza, who was saying this way back when. Yeah,
the only Jewish person ever to be excommunicated.
Yes. But he was saying precisely as this, the world is what it is. Mm-hmm. You can't change the world, but you can change your relationship to the world and the way you perceive it. Yeah. And in so doing, you're changing the probabilities of the future interactions. Mm-hmm. It's simple. Of course, Spinoza wasn't simple.
No, but
he was right.
As I recall, he basically told people, look, it's all in God's hands except that everything is from God. For that, he got excommunicated.
Yes.
Brenda Dunne, thank you so much for being
Jeffrey.
with me.
And thank you to your lovely audience.
Yes, thank you for being with us.